Well, good afternoon and hello, everyone. Welcome to the first water webinar of 2025. This is the first event of our six-part series, and I'd like to thank you so much for being here today and taking some time out of your Wednesday afternoon. We'll just take a few minutes here to let people log in and get settled. We've got about hopefully 150 or so odd people joining us today. And if a colleague of yours wasn't able to attend, or if you have to leave early, whatever the case might be, don't worry. We will be recording this webinar and we'll be in touch at the early point of next week with a full written recap and the video recording. So keep an eye out for that. And just a brief reminder here that when you signed up for the webinar, you did automatically become a Western Landowners Alliance member. So welcome. It's a free membership, but we do rely on support from members like you. So please do consider providing a donation. You can learn more about WLA and our work in the water space and everything else we do, and what it means to be a member by exploring our website and poking around via the link you see there in the chat that Morgan will share. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got some folks that are still continuing to roll in. We'll give it another minute or two, but we are really, really excited to convene today's panel and to launch another water webinar series. These have been a hit in the past, and we're so very thrilled to bring these to you again in the new year. So I think we're in a pretty good spot to get started here. I want to make sure we have enough time for our panel discussion and also some Q&A at the end. So let's get rolling. Again, welcome. My name is Jake Lebsack, and I am one of the communications coordinators for Western Landowners Alliance. I'd like to welcome you all to another WLA Water webinar series, and today's call, Restoring the Western Water Cycle, Can We Manage Land and Water to Improve the Water Cycle in the West, is the first of our six-part series. So over the next few months, this series will explore the topics of groundwater easements and irrigating for fish and food, water sharing programs, the system conservation pilot program, and so much more. And so you can find information about those webinars and you can register for them using the link there in the chat, courtesy of Morgan. So again, just a brief reminder that today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available for anyone who might have missed it or showed up late. And we will have a few minutes following today's panel discussion for some question and answers. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our staff. I'm joined by Louis Wirtz, WLA's Communications Director, and Morgan Wagner, the Western Water Program Director here at Western Landowners Alliance. So I'm going to pass it over to Morgan, who will provide a brief introduction to WLA and our work. Thank you, Morgan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Morgan Wagner, the Western Water Program Director here at WLA. WLA is a landowner-founded and landowner-led West-wide organization. Our mission is to sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Our membership represents millions of acres of both deeded and leased public lands under management across the West. We have a broad spectrum of land interest ownership types and political perspectives, but our common ground is a real love of the land and a desire to keep it whole and healthy for the benefits of people and wildlife. Our work at WLA is focused on empowering landowners and land managers with the knowledge, resources, and public policies they need to be successful. We're very pragmatic and solutions-oriented in our approach because we come from the land. We are landowners and managers. We also do a great deal with communications to try to help improve public dialogue on complex land and natural resource management issues and to increase understanding of the value of private and working lands and of private stewardship. As we consider the topic of today's webinar, the importance of these lands and those who steward them becomes particularly clear. The work being done to restore watersheds and keep working lands whole and healthy is a critical part of building resiliency in the face of an uncertain hydrological future. Land and water stewardship is not a band-aid. All of the management decisions that we make are how we can actively play a role in creating a more resilient future for the landscapes and communities we care so deeply about. We are here as a resource for all of you, and thanks again for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Morgan. Today's webinar will feature 3 speakers, followed by a brief Q&A session. So if you have a question for today's panelists, and we sure hope you do, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And you can also keep an eye on the chat function for resources. And we'd also love some introductions. So if you feel inclined, please do introduce yourself. We'd love to know who you are, where you are, and who you might be affiliated with. So please do share that now. Just to provide some context here, the goal of today's panel discussion is really to frame this series with some critical context. Everything from keeping working landscapes connected, whole, and healthy to, finding landowner-led solutions to water management and building resilience to drought. All of these things require an understanding of the systems that dictate our climate and our hydrology. So we often hear terms like the Western water crisis and the broken water cycle, but what does that really mean? And how exactly is the water cycle related to land management, our living landscapes, and other energy systems that influence our natural environment? And, maybe most importantly, how can we, in our respective roles, help to restore the water cycle and rehydrate the West? So these are some of the questions and the themes that we hope to not only cover today, but throughout this 6-part webinar series. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us for the remainder of this series. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. I'm joined by Dr. David Ellison, Zuzka Mulkerin, and Dr. Makenzie Skiles. So Dr. David Ellison is an interdisciplinary scientist whose work broadly spans the science, politics, and policy of forests, carbon, water, and energy cycles, and their relevance for the climate, sustainable development goals, and human well-being, the role of forests and forestry in climate policy frameworks, and the interaction of carbon, water, and energy cycles in promoting resilient, sustainable ecosystems are the 2 research areas in which he is most directly engaged. Dr. Ellison currently works as a guest researcher in the Natural Resource Policy Group, Earth System Science at the ETH in Zurich, and as a guest researcher in the Land Systems and Sustainable Land Management Group, Institute of Geography, University of Bern. And Zuzka Mulkerin is the program director at Voices of Water, part of the nonprofit organization Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Her passion for ecology drives her collaboration with groups such as Water Holistic, People and Water, ENKI, Eco Restoration Alliance, and the Global Repair Foundation, focusing on climate resilience education and watershed restoration. As an educator and program director, she strives to connect initiatives on both sides of the Atlantic through watershed-related projects. And her dedication to environmental restoration and ecosystem preservation makes her a powerful advocate for a healthier planet. Currently, she is collaborating on 2 books to be released mid-2025, Beat the Heat, The Climate Solution, and Water for Climate Healing, the new climate paradigm. And lastly, Dr. Makenzie Skiles is an associate professor and director of the Snow Hydro Lab in the School of Environment, Society, and Sustainability at the University of Utah. Her research group broadly pursues understanding of how much water is held as snow in mountains, when and how fast it will melt, and how seasonal snow water resources are changing over time. One of her main research trajectories has been investigating the processes and impacts of mineral dust deposition on snow here in the Western US, where changing snowmelt patterns have important implications for water security. Her original and pioneering research on snow darkening has been recognized through multiple awards, including as a Kavli Fellow and American Geophysical Union Early Career Award recipient. So thank you all again for joining us today. I'm really excited now to kick off our panel discussion. David, I'd like you to begin. Curious to know how carbon, water, the energy cycles are interconnected and why this understanding is critical for addressing climate change. Do we need to kind of reframe the way that we understand these cycles and how they're interconnected? And do we need to have a paradigm shift in the way in which we view these systems?
So thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to have a chance to be here and to talk with you. I think, yes, it's time for a paradigm shift. I think we're already halfway there, perhaps, certainly moving in that direction. Slowly, we're beginning to realize that a focus on carbon in the climate policy frameworks, for example, is not enough, and that we need to be thinking more broadly. And so I would first start talking a little bit about forest and water interactions, which is the carbon and water side of these cycles. Of course, The availability and storage of water on the land surface is first and foremost driven by the extent of tree and vegetation cover across the land. I mean, tree and vegetation cover help store water on the land surface. They promote infiltration and groundwater recharge. And evaporation from the land surface is actually very heavily vegetation dependent. So if we don't have tree and forest cover on the land surface, we have a very reduced amount of evaporation over land. This is, of course, very important to the rain cycle, which is the next point. Tree and forest cover further drive the availability of rainfall and water toward downwind coasts because they circulate water between the land surface and the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. So rainfall, when it comes down and lands on the land surface, it then gets evapotranspired back into the atmosphere, and then it has another chance to come down again as rainfall on the land surface. And tree, forest, and vegetation cover is, of course, essential in this cycle. If evaporation from the land surface is dependent on tree and forest cover, then of course we cannot have this precipitation recycling phenomenon without tree and forest cover. And of course, if we lose tree and forest cover on the land surface, then we also lose this precipitation recycling cycle. And that is important because tree and forest cover has a multiplier effect. It ultimately leads to more rainfall and more water availability on the land surface. And without this cycle, we lose that. So when we talk about the hydrologic cycle being broken, this is exactly the problem. We've deforested, for example, large amounts of the temperate zones in general. It's probably the most heavily deforested region on the planet, I generally tend to argue. And of course, this has a huge impact on the ability of land to recycle water across the land surface, lead to more rainfall, lead to more water availability. And then to bring in the energy cycle component here, of course, this evaporation of water from the land surface that is carried out by a tree, forest, and vegetation cover cools the land surface or keeps it from heating up. So without this phenomenon, open land, croplands, impervious surfaces in cities, urban heat islands, they become heat sinks. And so we need this vegetation in order to move heat or energy from the land surface into the lower atmosphere. And of course, this has one additional benefit, that it produces clouds. And clouds, or helps to produce clouds, is not the only phenomenon driving cloud formation. We also have clouds over oceans, but over land, it's incredibly important. So if we lose this rainfall, evapotranspiration, precipitation recycling cycle, we lose this cooling component over land, and the land becomes more and more of a heat sink. Clouds on the top reflect incoming solar radiation back out into space. So of course, if we lose cloud cover, we also heat the land surface more. So all of these things are completely interconnected. And maybe I'll just close with one more point. We need to think about these large-scale forest, water, and energy cycle phenomena when we're talking about improving the hydrologic cycle, and also when we're talking about climate buffering. These phenomena improve downwind water availability and improve cooling of the planet. It's, of course, not the only phenomenon. CO2 from other sources is a big issue, of course. I don't want to take away from that. But this is a very powerful phenomenon, and the numbers, if you look at them carefully, are actually quite large. So it's important. And so I think we need to move away from just thinking about the catchment and focusing only on watersheds, let's say, and think about these large-scale continental-wide phenomena. How can we improve these cycles across the land surface? How can we promote more precipitation recycling? So I do think we need a paradigm change. Hope that's
Great. Well, thanks, David. I think that's some important context to add here. And we're so glad to have you here today. Thanks again for agreeing to join us. Now, Zuzka, modern landscapes are designed to quickly drain rainwater through ditches and gutters, and we use pipes and reservoirs to, transport and store vast quantities of water. So, how are these modern and so-called efficient practices actually impacting landscapes and the overall health and resilience of the water cycle?
Thank you for that question. If I may, I'm going to share a couple of slides. Give me 1 second. Can you see the screen?
Looks great. Thanks.
Okay. So speaking about the paradigm, in 2007, a couple of friends and colleagues of Dr. Ellison wrote a book about the new water paradigm change and the need for it. And they called it Water for the Healing of Climate, which was the original title in my Slovak language. You can all hear my accent. And the second book, they're writing a second book with the collection of authors about how water is actually a vessel which can heal the climate. And we are all experiencing the problems with the climate change right now. But to answer your questions, how does the conventional water infrastructure which we have in our cities right now, and I mean in our farming systems, how does it impact the resilience? I'd like to look at how does the healthy watershed looks like. And you can see, as David was talking about transpiration, you can see the water cycles in motion here. However, when half of the humankind lives in the cities currently, we kind of lost touch with observing nature. And farmers and foresters can be the managers of nature. In my home country, Slovakia, there are Slovakia and other Central European countries. We say that about 80% of the state lands are managed by landowners, by farmers, ranchers, and foresters. So the climate actually is in their hands, how they manage their lands. I was very lucky to go to Colorado, to Denver. We went 3 years ago to celebrate the New Year's, and my sons wanted to ski. And when I saw this landscape, it's a beautiful picture. I took a picture, and I was surprised though how bare the land was. And as Dr. Ellison is saying, it can become a heat sink. And just 3 days after I took this picture, we were coming from the mountain, and at the foothills of Colorado mountains, we were surprised with the fierce winds. And we were witness to the Marshall Fire and the Middle Fork Fire. And I want to make the connection that the bare ground is to blame. One of my colleagues in Bio for Climate, Jim Laurie, his favorite, my favorite saying of his is, the bare ground should be illegal. The hot surfaces create temperature gradients, and then this temperature has to equalize somehow, one way or the other. And the reason I am talking about it right now, because I see an analogy with the unfortunate fires in California right now, when Santa Ana winds are very hot and coming from a dry desert. So this changing of landscape management actually can modify the weather patterns. As we were driving through the Marshall fires, we saw on the left here, you can see, we saw about 20 18-wheelers which were turned upside down. We were really worried about their lives. And it was heartbreaking when we were checking in a hotel after and driving through this fire to see the people who can just who packed all of their belongings into black garbage bags within like 2 minutes, and they had to leave. So yes, how we manage the lands that alters our weather. I'm looking at the US drought monitor, and you can see where the problem is right now. I've been in New Jersey for about 20 years. So here you can see in my home state, New Jersey, we've had droughts, horrible droughts this summer, and we also had fires. In New Jersey, it's very dangerous because we are the most populated states in the in the USA. So I took this picture where I was landing in Denver, and again, I see no vegetation, and I saw efforts that the restoration was in progress. But when my youngest son was looking at the University of Boulder at the time, the day after the fires, we saw uprooted trees. So I was looking around the campus, and as I do when I work with our scientists, and I could see that the water management, when you see that the water drains to rivers, it doesn't stay in a landscape. That's where the problem is. I'm not sure if I have time to go through more slides. I just want to say you can find more information on our website, Bio4Climate. I'm sorry. You can find all this information in our publications there. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Zuzka. It seems like, some of our management decisions can, in some cases, be more harmful than we care to admit, and wildfires serve as a stark reminder of the impacts of those decisions. Makenzie, I'd like to know, what the impacts look like when it comes to the Western water supply. In much of the West, most of our precipitation has historically fallen as snow, and the snowpack has, functioned as our largest reservoir. But can you explain the interconnections between land management, drought, and the hydrological cycle as they relate to the changing snowpack? And maybe just as some additional context here, what is dust on snow, and where does it fit into this bigger picture that David and Zuzka have explained?
Sure. So I'll just start with the sort of snow reservoir side of things. I think a lot of people who are landowners and land managers fully understand this, but depending on where you live in the Western US, between 50 and 80% of your water is going to be coming from seasonal snowmelt every year. So that's surface water. But then when we account for groundwater recharge, that number goes much higher. It goes up to 95 or even 99% of our water coming from seasonal snowmelt. And the patterns of seasonal snowmelt are changing. We're getting snow accumulating later in the winter because we have more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow. And then we have snow line elevations are rising. So we're not getting snow as low as we used to get for as long as we used to get. And then also we have snow melting earlier in the spring. And the magnitude of these changes varies depending on where you are in the Western US, how high the mountains are that are nearby, and the storm systems that you get. So in the Sierra Nevada, which tends to get most of their snow from atmospheric rivers, versus intercontinental West, which gets more northwesterly flow. It depends on where the snow is actually coming from and the magnitude of those patterns. But we know it's changing, and generally we can say that the snow water reservoir is in decline. And so one of the things that is impacting that is deposition of mineral dust on snow. And I'm just going to share my screen here to give a visual of what this actually looks like for those that are not that familiar. So when we have freshly fallen snow, this is the snow that we all like to picture. It's bright white. It reflects a lot of sunlight. And then we get episodic mineral dust deposition events in the spring, and those are emitted out of primarily arid and disturbed landscapes. And so when we say arid and disturbed, we kind of need to meet a number of sort of check boxes to get a dust event. And typically you need bare soil, and you need bare soil that is able to be picked up and transported by wind. And traditionally in the Western US, a lot of that disturbance has come from grazing. More modern disturbance can also come from stuff like oil and gas development or off-highway vehicle use. When you get these episodic dust events, this is a picture from Silverton, Colorado, in the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. It looks like you could be on Mars or on another planet. There's so much dust in the air. And then when the dust event recedes and the wind die down, the snow looks like this. So it leaves the snow dirty. And dirty snow absorbs more sunlight. And it's actually the amount of absorbed sunlight that determines the rate of snow melt timing and magnitude. People often associate this with air temperature, but air temperatures just get warmer in the spring because that's when days are getting longer and solar angles are increasing. So it's actually sunlight that melts the snow. And so this is one very important factor that is contributing to earlier snowmelt in the Western US. And part of the reason why it's such a big deal in the Western US is because we have so many dry landscapes adjacent to these sort of mountain or natural water reservoirs where seasonal snow accumulates. So here is a map of the Western US showing where dust is emitted from, and this is from remote sensing or satellite imagery. And then also in blue, where the snow cover is most persistent. So the adjacency of those orange areas to the blue areas indicates that our mountain snowpack is at particular risk for dust on snow deposition. And the controls on this, I can talk about a little bit more in the next question and sort of how this is changing over time. But we do know that this is playing a really important part in the water cycle here in the Western US, and that it really is impacting the timing of when water comes out. And so, if water is flowing out of the mountains in April and soils are still cold and aren't in need of, sort of irrigation at that point, there's this timing mismatch between when water is available and when water can be used. And that can lead to issues later in the summer when water is really needed and runoff has already completed in the mountains. So I will stop sharing and stop there and wait for the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Makenzie. Looking forward to the next question. You did kind of touch on the connection between land management and the water cycle, and I'd like to take this moment to dig a bit deeper there with David. So, Dr. Ellison, how do vegetation and soil health influence local and regional water cycles, and what is their role in stabilizing precipitation patterns? You've devoted your career to it, and you've mentioned it a little bit today, but a lot of your work has focused around forests and trees. But I'm curious to know, how grasslands and other Western landscapes might play a similar or different role in regulating climate.
I think the grassland question will probably come in the next round, but I'm going to be focused on soils and forests for now, or vegetation. I do think that the local and regional water cycles are highly dependent upon vegetation and soil health. And we just saw a perfect example of this, right? If the soil health is not good, if there's no vegetation sort of there to keep it in place, it blows in all kinds of places, and of course places where we don't want it to be. So without healthy vegetation and soil, it also reduces evaporation, right? So if we don't have healthy soils and vegetation, we can't have this evaporation from the land surface. And without this evaporation from the land surface, we might have about 1/3 of the annual precipitation that we currently have. These things are, of course, extremely closely tied together. But at the same time, I would like to sort of point to this idea that of the two, soil and vegetation health, I tend to think that vegetation health matters a lot more. I focus more on forests, so I'm biased. I naturally tend to think this. But of course, vegetation health is important for soil health because it's ideally what drives the production of soil and thus ensures soil health in the first place. In other words, if we don't have good vegetation, then we don't have litter fall, and we don't have biomass degrading on the ground surface, which then becomes soil in the first place. So the availability of tree and vegetation cover is the first key component in terms of improving the quality of soils. And so the longer we can have an active vegetation cover, tree and forest, ideally over soils, the better, because that will improve the soils, improve infiltration and groundwater recharge. And of course, it also helps soils to better retain water because it recharges carbon in the soils, which means that soils that are high in carbon are much better at retaining water in the first place, right? So all of these things are very closely and tightly linked together. And of course, if we lose the vegetation cover, soils degrade, they get blown away, they land on top of mountains, they land on top of solar cells, they land everywhere. So while grasslands and forests may differ in terms of their impacts, let's say on the hydrologic cycle, forests will evapotranspire more than grasslands for the most part. It's not a good idea to plant forests where they're not likely to grow. Usually the natural landscape, if it's a grassland landscape, naturally, there's not enough water available to support forests in the first place. So we sort of want to choose the natural landscape cover which would ordinarily be there. And of course, grasslands are adapted for a specific, more water deficit location, more arid landscapes, and forests are adapted to other kinds of landscapes. Yeah. So when I tend to put a focus on working on the hydrologic regime, I'm more interested in trying to restore the natural evapotranspiration regime. That would be sort of the key component, I think, because that's the first and most important thing. And then everything else tends to follow that. Improves precipitation recycling, it improves soil quality, it generates more soil. Yeah, I think I would stop there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. I think that segues nicely into this next question here for Zuzka, which is maybe a little bit more about forests, which, one of the key concepts of biodiversity for livable climates work is the biotic pump theory, which was developed by scientist Anastasia Makryeva, one of the voices of water scientists. So Zuzka, can you explain how this mechanism works, what this theory is, and how it could be applicable to landscapes even outside of the world's great forests like the Amazon?
It's a great question because for those who are familiar with the biotic pump theory, yes, we usually talk about forests, but as my colleagues in Water Holistic always say, every raindrop counts in Amazon, but also in our landscape, on our farming lands. So we need to look at how healthy watersheds look like. I am using the slide from our GBH presentation, which I produced a couple of years ago. It's on our website. It's a slide which talks about the storm tracks and hurricanes for last couple of decades. And what I want to point out is that, do you see any hurricanes between the Amazon and Congo? There are none. And the reason is because there are forests, as Dr. Ellison says. However, when you see Sahara, you see the hurricanes. And what we want to do is not to have bare ground, to lessen the impact of these storms. And how do we start? We can start in our backyard. One tree doesn't make a forest, yes, but our backyards, our lands, our working lands should reflect that evaporation is one of the basic cornerstones of life. I have an example here of one tree with a 10-yard canopy. And on a good day, it pumps the water, which it absorbs through its root, and it can pump about 100 gallons of water per day. And if you have many of these trees or the proper vegetation and crops, let's say orchards, you can improve the hydrology of your lands. But again, all of this is possible when there is enough soil moisture. Biotic pump itself is a concept by Viktor Gorchkov and Anastasia Makareva, which also came out with 2007. When water vapor condenses in a liquid, it compresses. And you have from about 250, 300 gallons of water vapor, you get condensation, which comes down as rain. And this is very important. That creates a lower, kind of like a partial vacuum, lower pressure, and that kind of like brings the atmospheric moisture from the oceans. We are working on a book which about educating the plant education, which will be available later on, and we will be talking about developing a course how to help land managers and town managers to understand that evaporation is really the basic for understanding the water cycle. We are working with these scientists. I would like to stress that that each of us can improve the landscape around us and help the biotic pump to work. It's very hard to cover it within a few minutes. So again, I hope this conversation will continue. And I'm giving the floor to a next question.
Thanks, Zuzka. Well, we hope we can continue this dialogue and look forward to continuing to work with you. But in the meantime, Makenzie, back to you for some dust on snow here. So if deforestation and land degradation and aridification, if all of these things can disrupt the processes of hydrological systems, I'm curious how dust on snow interacts with other drivers of hydrological change, like climate warming or altered precipitation patterns. And, what are the factors that are contributing to these extreme dust years? And where do we sit now? Where are we trending? What does the data show us?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start there with what the data can show us, and I will just share my screen again. So we are able to use remote sensing or satellite imagery to look at the impacts or study the patterns of dust on snow deposition, or what we kind of simplified as snow darkening over time. And so here's just some records from the remote sensing satellite record, where this middle one, the orange and yellow, is showing median radiative forcing, and that's just the additional amount of sunlight that's absorbed by dust. And the next map is showing how persistent dust on snow is. How long is it at the surface of the snowpack impacting melt? So we can take, a couple decades worth of satellite imagery, and we can summarize it actually and look at the trends and the magnitudes of this impact over the snow water reservoir over time. And actually what we see is a slight declining trend over time over the last 23 years, where in the early part of the 2000s, between 2001 and 2012 or so, we had multiple large extreme dust years. And when we say extreme dust years, That means that the snow melt was accelerated by almost 2 months. So up to 5, 6, or even 7 weeks over snow if it were dust free. And so that can have a dramatic impact on the hydrologic cycle. And in more recent years, it's not that we don't get dust on snow. We've never had a winter since I've been studying it, since we haven't seen dust on snow or the impacts of dust on snow. But what we've seen is that there's consistent impacts year to year, but less frequent, really high dust years in the most recent part of the record in the last 10 years. And when we work with arid land and soil scientists to sort of tease out why this might be happening, what we see is some broader climate drivers that have, and bear with me here because there's some feedbacks that are a little bit intricate, but the climate drivers have led to actually slightly lower wind speeds. And in some of the most critical areas have led to slightly more vegetation. So this can be sort of woody vegetation that grows in arid lands. And when you have more vegetation and lower wind speeds, you get less dust and you get fewer extreme dust events that carry a lot of soil on those. But when we look at those patterns, we see some variability with just climate scale variability. And so this could shift again in the next decade as we see climate patterns shift. Because ultimately, if the landscape dries out, it won't support the vegetation. That stabilizes those surface winds and reduces the amount of dust that's emitted and then deposited on the landscape. And we do know that at a certain point, what we see with dust is that it's primarily related to surface disturbance, but that it's also related to drought. At a certain point, you get soils that are dry enough, you don't get enough vegetation, those soils will get picked up by wind and deposited downwind. And I just want to say that I'm showing this map for the Upper Colorado River Basin, but we can do this analysis anywhere. So here's similar plots for the headwaters of the Great Salt Lake. And in the Great Salt Lake region, it's sort of different patterns. A lot of the dust in the Intermountain West and Great Basin are coming from playas. And as our internally draining water sources are decreasing in size because water is being used upstream and not making it down into, say, the Great Salt Lake, we're exposing more area of playa, and that is another dust source. So some of these dynamics are a little bit different depending on where you look, but there's always a link. There's always a link back to climate warming and drought and climate variability. And I'm not sure that we fully understand all of those linkages yet, but we're certainly working hard to understand them better.
Yeah, thanks, Makenzie. Really interesting there. Just another important reminder about how interconnected all of these systems are. So now I'd like to shift into maybe the more hopeful and helpful part of the panel here. David, what can we do about it? With landscapes becoming more and more fractured, can land stewards, can ranchers, can water managers, can the folks on this call play a role in helping to not only restore these cycles, but maybe do so at scale? And what are the policies or incentives that might need to happen or that have helped people do this type of work on the ground without significant burden?
Great. So I would like to clearly underline this idea that fractured and fragmented landscapes are a huge problem for the hydrologic landscape and the transfer and transport of water across landscapes. When we talk about the hydrologic cycle, forest and water actions being broken, it is because there have been all these land use conversions away from other forest cover and tree cover to croplands and also to city landscapes. And of course, this creates a huge problem for the hydrologic cycle and for warming of the surface of the planet. But at the same time, I would argue that any and all additional tree and forest cover, for the most part, is valuable for improving the hydrologic cycle, hydrologic circulation infiltration and groundwater storage across the land surface. So wherever we can, and I'm speaking to farmers and everybody here, everywhere we can add trees, it's a fantastic idea to do so. Now, of course, we can't just convert all croplands to tree and forest cover because most of us like to eat. We sort of depend on agricultural production, and food security is, of course, a huge issue these days. But that doesn't mean that we can't add tree and forest cover to the land surface also on farmlands. And there are at least a couple of ways in which one can do this. Agroforestry is now sort of an up-and-coming big discussion about how we can add trees to the agricultural landscape to actually make it more productive, because trees do a couple of things very nicely. They can shade the landscape, they can encourage infiltration and groundwater recharge, they can add more carbon to the soils through litter fall from leaves and so on. So they have positive benefits if they're used carefully and in the right ways. So agroforestry, I think, is certainly one direction that we should be exploring as much as that is possible. But I would also add that there are lots of areas on farmland landscapes that aren't productive in terms of agriculture per se, where you could add tree and forest cover. And when you ask me about sort of policies one could use to promote these things, the first thing that comes to mind, I've been working much more on European Union related policies and less so on American policies. And the Common Agricultural Policy in the European Union historically has encouraged the removal of all trees from the landscape. In fact, you could not be a beneficiary of the direct payment system in the Common Agricultural Policy if you had more than 60 trees per hectare on your land, right? Which is already a very, very small number of trees. So farmers, in order to ensure that they would be recipients of the direct payments, removed trees from the landscape. Now, this is heresy in today's world with climate change and all this knowledge about the consequences of deforestation and tree and forest cover loss on the land surface. We would never understand this idea anymore, but it still takes a long time to sort of remove that subsidy framework, that policy framework from the Common Agricultural Policy in order to change people's minds. And so I go around all the time now, and as much as I can, I say, look, there are lots of places on farmland landscapes where you can plant more trees. Shelter belts are an interesting use of tree cover. Around farmhouses, you can plant all kinds of trees. You can create biodiverse rich zones around water sources that you have, which are beneficial for the water source, right? Because they promote more infiltration and groundwater recharge whenever there's rainfall, helps improve the quality of any water resource that you might have on your land. And of course, you need that water, right? So you want to protect it as best you can. Surrounding water and surrounding waterways with riparian zones, with trees along the edge of rivers and lakes is also good for them, because it protects the water against nutrient flows from agriculture. So there are any number of reasons why adding tree and forest cover to the farmland landscapes is a good idea. All kinds of benefits from doing so. I can't really think of any downsides from having more tree and forest cover on the farmland landscape. So I would certainly encourage farmers to take that message home and think about it carefully and add trees and forest cover to every part of the landscape that you possibly can, because I think it's beneficial and it certainly doesn't hurt. And if there's a subsidy system in the US, I do not know the subsidy system in the US as well as I know the European one these days, but certainly subsidies can be used to encourage farmers to plant more biodiverse rich. They can be small zones, they don't even have to be big ones, right? But any addition is a positive benefit in terms of the hydrologic cycle, in terms of the quality of the land use, in terms of the quality of the soils, and so on. So I would say, get to it.
Thanks, David. It's a great message. Zuzka, managing the land and improving infiltration by slowing and spreading water and focusing on agroforestry, as we heard from David, and improving vegetation cover. These are all techniques to help restore the water cycle. But how important is biodiversity? David touched on it briefly there, but recognizing that some relationships with wildlife can be more complicated than others, and management challenges can certainly exist in certain landscapes. What role do insects and fungi and other organisms play in improving hydrological health? Where does that piece fit into the puzzle?
That is a great question, and it will be hard to cover it during the short time, because so many of us live in silos. Like, there are biodiversity people, there are water people, there are carbon people, and all of this is linked. We have several courses. We've been at Bio4Climate. We've been doing them for years, and we have a couple of upcoming courses when you can learn about the 6 kingdoms of life, about the roles of plants, of each plants, animals, fungi, in the water cycle. Maybe I can share some slides again. Give me a second. Okay, so plants, right? They are so important because they transport the water, living water, through the whole plant. And I took this picture in Charleston because their oaks are really good and old. You can't see this much water inside, living water inside a plant in freshly planted forest. So this tells us we do need to protect old growth forests and old growth trees, because this picture just shows the transpiration and the water content, but as you can see in this chart, which was done by my colleague in Bio4Climate, the plants are taking carbon dioxide, making sugars, and during this process they create glomalin, and glomalin holds a lot of water. The fungi need air to breathe, and so this cooperation is ultimately improving the water cycle and the carbon cycle. As in lots of our courses, we always stress we do need each other. We people need each other, and in biodiversity, has so many components, and we do. So we are a symbiosis team. I love that expression. And when you look at it that way, when you look at our world that way, you understand these little carbon farmers, which are in the right corner of this chart. When you look at the history, we used to have large herds of buffaloes in our plains, and now we have a chance to have livestock. They create the hoof action, which also improves the water infiltration. There is this very interesting fact, which my colleague Jim worked with the University of Texas, when they observed the dung beetles. If there are any ranchers in this call, they may know that the dung beetles are able to bury 1 ton of wet manure in 1 acre of land just in 1 day. So yes, biodiversity and even the little insects such as dung beetles, they create carbon-rich humus, and then they improve the soil structure. This chart was done many years ago, 2 decades ago, in 2007. This is before we included the beavers. Beavers, as the eco-engineers, and we have a lot. I'm sorry, I don't want to digress. They can create these water dams, which my colleagues in Water Holistic are and many water managers in this country are learning to mimic with the beaver dam analogs. They improve the water regime of the country. They improve the water budget of all the landscape. This picture is taken in Nevada, the driest state, I think. They have or normally they have really problems with droughts, but this picture I think is taken by Carol Evans, which did a beautiful, wonderful job with beavers and the ranchers. And we have a lot of resources on our website about it. So this is just some statistics. How, when you saw that first picture of the Rocky Mountains and the plains, you saw no animals there, and that means that if the soil doesn't have good aggregates and soil sponge, then it acts as a heat sink. Whereas if there are dung beetles doing their job with all these beautiful animals, they create good soil. This is an old picture where we can see how much soil was lost just because our agricultural practices and the grasses did not have the animals on it anymore to convert it in the carbon-rich soil sponge. The fungi have a beautiful mycelium network, which is looking like a soft brain tissue, and they are very, very important in the hydrological cycle. This is more information about our dung beetles, and I don't want to skip the freshwater mussels, which are really important, and they can keep our ecosystems healthy. Again, we have more information on our website and many more courses coming up.
Well, thank you, Zuzka. I'm taking note of the time here. It looks like we've got a little bit more to cover and some great questions that we'd love to get to. So if it's okay with the speakers, I think we'll extend by just a few minutes. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, but would love to pose a few questions to everyone following Makenzie's final question here. So Makenzie, I'd like you to close out our panel for us here with two questions. The first is, how might improved rangeland management or other land and water stewardship practices help address the dust on snow problem? And lastly, and maybe most importantly, and maybe one that will help to address some of the questions that we're seeing is, how do we balance the need for conserving water and preparing for an uncertain hydrologic future with keeping soil healthy and land productive?
Yeah, so I think this is it. It's funny because I feel like whenever experts talk about what's going on with the landscape, especially in the Western US, we tend to, it's like we're pointing a lot of fingers, but that is never sort of the intent of when I'm giving my spiel, because I think everyone is just doing the best they can with the landscape they have. And the solution to lower dust is relatively straightforward. It's to keep ground cover on the soils and not to sort of just let bare ground be exposed, especially if it has been recently disturbed or recently tilled. And if there is, say, for example, fields that are lying fallow, let native vegetation or plant vegetation that's a native mix on those fallow fields to reduce dust emission. And a lot of the historical dust did come from grazing, but those are not the same grazing practices that we have today, which are, frequently and more frequently focused on healthy landscapes and conserving those landscapes. And other sources of dust have become more common. So if it's a playa or a dry landscape, I mean, there are just places in the Western US where trees are not going to grow, or certain type of vegetation are not going to grow. And in those places, the way to reduce dust is to allow natural crusts to form and then not to disturb those crusts. So often playas are stable until disturbed. So those can be salt crusts or physical crusts. Or if you have a landscape where vegetation will grow, to allow vegetation to grow. And then other sort of common sense stuff like, you know, if you check the wind speeds and the wind speeds are going to be high, don't do anything that could disturb the soils on those days. There's a lot of stuff that can be done that makes a lot of sense across the board to reduce dust and minimize that impact. But some of the stuff is out of our hands, and it's been sort of longer term land management practices that we can now work towards sort of healing the land and healing the hydrologic cycle. And that takes an effort from everybody across the board. And we are certainly working on that, and there's a long way to go. And I think the most important thing is that we all just think of these landscapes as systems, and every system is connected, even if that system starts as water and sort of this far off mountain peak that is storing our water for us during the winter and then melting during the spring. And I know we're sort of running out of time, and there's been great questions. So I'll just end it with, I think people do what they can to maintain healthy landscapes. And then they, as long as people think about these sort of common sense solutions to reduce dust, then over time, hopefully this part of my research will kind of go away, because we'll have less dust and less dust on snow to worry about in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Makenzie, and thank you all so much for joining us today. I understand that it's the top of the hour and some of you might need to leave, but in the event that you're able to join us, please do stick around, and we'll try to get to a few questions here. I don't think we're going to extend it by that much, but would like to at least pose one question to our panelists here. So thank you all for submitting those. David, I'd like to start with you. There's been a little bit of traction in the chat when it comes to kind of this complicated nature of woody encroachment. Ranchers and landowners and land managers across the West have kind of been hearing about this a lot, and so there might be some hesitation when it comes to actually planting trees, just because of the complicated nature of the data and showing conifer encroachment on grassland and increasing forest density might actually reduce runoff, infiltration, and groundwater recharge in some areas. So I'm curious to know, how you might square that data with what you're saying, and some recommendations for folks when it comes to kind of understanding this complicated relationships on these varied landscapes. Looks like might be a mute issue there.
So it's always risky to try and compact a lot of ideas into 5 minutes of discussion. And one of the, I think, most important points that I have sort of glossed over in this discussion is that, so at the catchment scale, it's clear that if we add more trees to the land cover, that creates more evaporation, and most of that evaporation will eventually come down as rainfall, but primarily somewhere else, right? So if we plant more trees in one catchment where the water flows, right, it can lead to reductions in the available amount of water within the catchment. Now there's a trade-off here, right? So at some level, you can add tree and forest cover, and it will help improve infiltration and groundwater recharge without necessarily challenging the evapotranspiration regime. And if you can find that sweet spot, I could talk about it at more length. It's better to have some graphs to be able to illustrate what I'm trying to say here. But if you can find that sweet spot, you can sort of maximize infiltration and groundwater recharge, but try and keep evapotranspiration to a minimum. But if you're in a catchment that has a lot of water, then of course you want to plant as much tree and forest cover as you can and encourage evapotranspiration as much as you possibly can. But this is sort of a long way of saying that we still need to think about the catchment, because we need to understand the water balance that's available in individual catchments. We don't want to overplant tree and forest cover in individual catchments, because we've completely transformed for human needs almost all catchments across the globe, but certainly across the US, right? And a lot of the water is used for other things. So now that sort of needed water balance is somehow different. And so there are limitations in some locations, especially in the more dry and arid locations, with regard to how much additional tree and forest cover one can plant. So I think one needs to be conscious of that, but ideally we would prefer to have more infiltration and to maximize infiltration and groundwater recharge, to have this sweet spot, arrive at the sweet spot, and then above that as much additional evapotranspiration as the catchment can tolerate. So the idea would still be to maximize evapotranspiration as much as possible within the confines of the water demand within the individual catchment, and that varies a lot. But like I said, there are plenty of catchments that aren't challenged in this way, right? They have too much water. Flooding is, a continuous problem in many locations, or across the Mississippi Basin, for example. And so additional tree and forest cover isn't really as big of a problem in those areas. So it really depends on where you are. You need to be very, very conscious of the circumstances in which you are planting additional tree and forest cover. So I tend to work at a very global, universal scale, but every time I focus on a specific region, I find that the problems at the specific regional level are very, very different. All the principles I look at are the same in terms of precipitation, recycling, evapotranspiration is the key, promoting infiltration and groundwater recharge, but each location is different. Wind and weather patterns in each location are different. So the tool that is suitable to a specific location depends very much on that specific location, keeping in mind the general universal principles that we're talking about. I hope that's an answer.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks, David. I'll just remind everyone here that we will be providing a pretty comprehensive breakdown of everything that we've heard today, including all of the science that pertains to everything that the speakers have shared, as well as some of their publications as well. So we know there's a lot to cover here, and we don't have nearly enough time to really break it all down in the way that it probably deserves. But we hope that this is just simply a framer and a tool as we dig into the next 6 months of water webinar talk. So with that, I think one of the great advantages, that being said, of today's panel and today's topic is kind of this global, the global perspectives that Zuzka and David both bring, and of course the regional specialty that Makenzie has. And so Zuzka, I have a question for you here, which is, what about the future of water management and restoring our water cycles brings you hope? And maybe in the context of some of the things that you've seen or that you interact with as it relates to the global water community, what are some takeaways that we should all maybe tune into when it comes to the work that other folks are doing?
Oh my gosh, there is so much hope. I would like to recommend all the books by Judy Schwartz, for example, where she explains how the water is hiding in the plain sight in a very in a language understandable for everybody. I'd like to point out one example on a book I was working with Jan Pokorny, the plant botanist. And that relates to farming and ranching. So we talked about the frost, the damages which the farmers can have in their orchards when the frost strike. We had, as Makenzie was explaining, the winters are erratic, and farmers have different time scales to work with, and to plant their crops and to prepare for the harvest. I'd like to point out about the forest. So there is this interesting phenomenon, and in the course we are preparing, we can teach the land managers how to not just rely on the worldwide satellite data, how they can measure it themselves. They will realize that if their fields are, let's say, close to a forest stand, which is large enough to provide a moisture buffer, that farmer will not suffer the frost, the early frost or the late spring frost, and that translates, as a former finance person, that translates to huge economical advantages, or if you don't do this right, it translates to insurance claims, which amount to millions of dollars within each state. So if you understand how this works, we have a plan for town managers, town councils, and just regular schools, regular people and landowners. If they understand how this works, they will understand there is hope for their livelihoods, for their crops, and for their future. So there is a lot we can learn from each other, and I'm looking forward to more.
Well, thanks, Zuzka. Excited to see those resources. Sounds invaluable. Makenzie, over to you here for the final question of the day. And I think it's probably on everyone's mind here as we're seeing what's happening in California. I'm sure it's being researched, but curious to know if you can add a little bit more color to the question surrounding the impact of wildfire ash on snow. It's obviously going to be a growing issue, and ever more important that we understand the data. So where does that science stand? What does it all mean? And what is there left to learn?
Yeah, I'll start by maybe breaking it up into some like the differences in time of when it happens. So during a fire, the fire is emitting black carbon or soot, and also some charred woody debris can be associated with that emission. Or grass fires can also emit black carbon, but with less charred woody debris. It just depends on where the fire is taking place. And that, that emission during the fire can travel on the wind and then land downwind. And typically these fires are occurring now during summer or late summer. And so what is directly impacted during the fire occurrence tends to be perennial snow and ice cover. So glaciers tend to be impacted at the time of fire. There are, as is happening in LA right now, increasingly exceptions to this idea of that fires tend to occur in summer and fall rather than wintertime. But for the most part, up until now, impacts during fire have occurred to permanent snow and ice cover. But after a fire has passed through a landscape, depending on the fire intensity, it can leave behind basically exposed snow cover that used to be beneath canopy cover, and then also charred stumps and debris left behind after the fire. And that can continue to deposit dark material onto the snow surface for years after the fire. And that can impact seasonal snow cover that has been deposited across these burned landscapes. And that kind of can have a double whammy because it's darker and it's more exposed to the sun because the canopy has been removed by the fire. And so we find in many of those landscapes that snow is melting quicker. And there are exceptions to this as well, not in all places and not in all years, but for the most part, in a burned landscape, that snow is melting earlier. And so there's still a lot of work to be done on this, but as fires tend to be more intense and burn more land and happen more frequently in the Western US, this is also something that we need to be thinking about in terms of snow water supply.
Yeah, thanks, Makenzie. It's a sobering reminder. Well, thank you all so very much for joining us this afternoon. We've got a lot more questions that we could get to, but I think what we're going to do is actually follow up with our panelists via email and get some written responses, and we will send those out to the folks that asked them. And for everyone else, we'll be in touch probably around the Monday or Tuesday mark of next week with a full video recording, a written recap, all of the sources, the science, the information, and the resources that were shared throughout today's conversation. So thank you all so very much for joining us. We hope to see you next month for our next water webinar. And for the months after that, we'll go all the way to June with this new 6-part water webinar series. So just one final thanks to the Walton Family Foundation and all of our amazing partners for supporting our water program and our work more broadly. And thank you to our members for supporting WLA and our mission. And lastly, thank you so much again to our panelists and to everyone that joined us in the audience. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you hopefully in February. Thanks so much, all. Take care. Bye-bye.